It started with a faint tapping on the Warren family's window. It was 2:33 a.m., and the quiet suburban street was cloaked in darkness. Emma, their neighbor, lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, when she heard it. A soft but deliberate tap, tap, tap. At first, she thought it might be the wind, but there was no wind that night, and the noise was too rhythmic to be random. Curiosity gnawed at her. She pulled aside the curtain, her breath fogging the cold glass. What she saw chilled her to the bone. Lila, the 8-year-old girl next door, stood barefoot on the lawn, wearing a white nightgown that gleamed eerily in the moonlight. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle as she gazed up at her own bedroom window. Emma froze. "Lila," she whispered to herself, but Lila wasn't alone. A small porcelain doll dangled from her hand, its face cracked, one painted eye missing. The girl suddenly turned her head sharply toward Emma's window. Even from a distance, Emma could feel the intensity of her stare. The doll dropped to the ground with a muted thud. Before Emma could react, Lila sprinted inside her house, moving so fast it seemed unnatural. The door slammed shut, the noise echoing down the empty street. The next morning, Emma hesitated before heading to the Warrens' house. She knocked gently, unsure if she wanted an answer. Mrs. Warren opened the door, her face pale and drawn. "Emma, hi," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I saw Lila outside last night," Emma began cautiously. "Is she okay?" Mrs. Warren's face tightened. "Lila hasn't been feeling well lately. Night terrors. You know how kids are." She trailed off, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Emma could hear something faint from inside the house. It was a child's laughter, but it didn't sound like Lila. The voice was high-pitched, distorted, and echoed unnaturally. "Is that her?" Emma asked, stepping closer. Mrs. Warren hesitated. "It's just the TV." But Emma wasn't convinced. Lila had always been a quiet, sweet child. She loved coloring books and tea parties, and her laughter was the kind that could light up a room. But over the past months, something had changed. It started small, lost appetite, sleepless nights. Then came the strange behaviors, whispering to herself, laughing when no one else was around, and her newfound obsession with the doll. "She found it in the attic," James Warren explained one evening, his voice lined with frustration. "An old thing left by the previous owners. It's creepy, sure, but it's just a doll." Emma wasn't so sure. Lila had begun carrying the doll everywhere, whispering to it like it was alive. Sometimes, when Emma watched from her window, she thought she saw the doll's head move. The tension in the Warren household grew thicker by the day. Mrs. Warren confided in Emma one afternoon while Lila played outside. "She says the doll talks to her," she whispered, her hands trembling. "She calls it Bella, says Bella tells her secrets. I've heard her at night, talking to it, but when I open her door, she just stares at me." "What kind of secrets?" Emma asked, feeling a chill creep down her spine. Mrs. Warren's eyes welled with tears. "Horrible thing. She says Bella told her about a man who died in this house. And sometimes, she says Bella tells her to hurt us." That night, Emma woke to a blood-curdling scream. She bolted upright and rushed to her window. The Warrens' house was ablaze with lights. James Warren staggered out the front door, clutching his hand, which was wrapped in a blood-soaked towel. "She bit me," he shouted, his voice filled with both anger and fear. Mrs. Warren appeared behind him, her face pale. "It wasn't her," she whispered. "James, that wasn't our daughter." Emma hurried over, her heart pounding. "What happened?" she asked. She just snapped," James said, shaking his head. "I tried to take that damn doll away, and she attacked me like a wild animal. Her eyes, they weren't Lila's eyes." Mrs. Warren sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. "We need help," she whispered. This isn't normal. Inside the house, Lila sat at the top of the stairs, cradling Bella in her arms. Her lips curled into a smile that didn't belong on a child's face. "Bella says you'll regret this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Over the next few days, things escalated. The Warrens heard scratching sounds inside the walls at night. Objects moved on their own. Lila's voice echoed through the house, even when she wasn't there. Emma began having nightmares. Dreams of shadowy figures standing at her bedside, of Lila's doll watching her with its unblinking eye. She took the dream seriously. Dreams of shadowy figures standing at her bedside, of Lila's doll watching her with its unblinking eye. Father Gabriel was called in after Mrs. Warren found claw marks on the walls of Lila's room. The priest was an older man, his face weathered by years of dealing with the unexplainable. He arrived with a small leather bag and a quiet determination. Mrs. Warren said nothing. Mrs. Warren said, "This isn't just about the girl," he said after walking through the house. "Something is here. Something ancient." He knelt before Lila, who sat cross-legged on the floor, her head tilted as she stared at him. "Do you know who I am, child?" he asked gently. Lila giggled, but the sound was hollow, devoid of warmth. "Bella knows you," she said in a sing-song voice. And what does Bella say about me?" Lila's smile vanished. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and her voice deepened, echoing unnaturally. "She says you'll burn." The room grew icy cold. A gust of wind blew through, extinguishing the candles Father Gabriel had lit. The priest stood his ground, his lips moving in silent prayer. That night, Emma dug through old records at the local library. What she found made her blood run cold. The previous owner of the Warrens' house had been a man named Samuel Harker. He was a reclusive doll maker who was rumored to dabble in dark rituals. He disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind a collection of dolls. Bella, it seemed, was one of them. When Emma returned to the Warrens' house to share her findings, she found Mrs. Warren sitting alone in the kitchen, her face pale and her hands shaking. "She's gone," Mrs. Warren whispered. "What do you mean, gone?" Emma asked. Mrs. Warren pointed to the back door, which hung open, creaking in the night breeze. "Lila's gone. And she took the doll with her." Seren pulled the Emma. Mrs. Warren and Father Gabriel searched the neighborhood frantically, calling out for Lila. The night was suffocatingly quiet, the air thick with an unnatural chill. The streetlights flickered ominously, and shadows seemed to writhe along the edges of their vision. They found Lila at the edge of the woods behind the house, standing perfectly still in a clearing. Her white nightgown fluttered in the breeze, and Bella dangled from her hand. The doll's single painted eye gleamed in the moonlight, its cracked face grinning as if it were alive. "Lila!" Mrs. Warren cried, rushing toward her daughter. Father Gabriel grabbed her arm, stopping her. "Wait," he warned, his voice trembling. "Something's not right." Jerome Schaff. "But how did I get—" Lila turned her head slowly, unnaturally, until her gaze met theirs. Her eyes were entirely black, two empty voids that seemed to suck in the light around them. She smiled, a cruel, hollow expression that didn't belong on her innocent face. "She's not yours anymore," a deep, guttural voice rasped from her lips. "Lila, please," Mrs. Warren begged, tears streaming down her face. Father Gabriel stepped forward, clutching a crucifix tightly in one hand and a vial of holy water in the other. "In the name of the Lord, release this child," he commanded, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. Lila, or whatever had taken her, laughed. The sound echoed through the clearing, a horrible, distorted cacophony that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "She belongs to Bella now," the voice hissed. "And soon." so will you. The ground beneath Lila's feet began to crack, dark tendrils of smoke rising from the earth. Father Gabriel muttered prayers under his breath, splashing holy water in a wide arc. The tendrils recoiled, hissing angrily, but they didn't retreat completely. Especially that last word. Small vines splashing holy water in a wide arc. The tendrils recoiled, hissing angrily, but they didn't retreat completely. "Hold her down," the priest shouted. Emma and Mrs. Warren hesitated, fear paralyzing them. But when Lila lunged toward them with unnatural speed, they acted. They grabbed her arms, struggling to keep her still as she thrashed and screamed, her strength far exceeding that of a child. Father Gabriel began the exorcism, his voice rising above the deafening roar that filled the clearing. Lila's screams grew louder, more animalistic, as Bella fell from her grasp. The doll landed upright, its head snapping toward them. "You cannot save her," the voice growled from the doll. "She is mine." Ignoring the voice, Father Gabriel continued his prayers, his hands trembling as he held the crucifix aloft. The air grew colder, frost forming on the grass and leaves around them. Firmly ingrained in the cross, Father Gabriel's fingers tightened on the trigger and he levered up his arms. The fleeting truce restored their temper. The crowd let out a single expectant cry. Suddenly, Lila went limp. "Lila," Mrs. Warren whispered, shaking her daughter gently. Lila opened her eyes, her blackened irises now gone, replaced with the soft brown they all recognized. "Mommy," she whispered weakly. Relief washed over Mrs. Warren as she pulled her daughter into her arms. But the moment was short-lived. Bella's head twisted sharply, the crack of porcelain echoing through the clearing. The doll's single eye glowed red, and the ground beneath it split open. A horrific, shadowy figure began to emerge, its form shifting and writhing, as if it were made of smoke and fire. "You thought you could banish me," the entity roared. "I am eternal." Father Gabriel stepped forward, his face pale but resolute. "I will end this," he shouted, pulling a small worn book from his bag. "Now!" Lila screamed, clutching her mother tightly. "It wants you to try." "Ha!" But it was too late. As the priest began chanting, the entity surged toward him, enveloping him in a cloud of darkness. His screams pierced the night, and when the smoke cleared, he was gone. Only the crucifix remained, charred and broken. He heard Francis say, as the crucifix remained, charred and broken. The entity turned its attention to Emma and the Warrens. "One must stay," it growled. "One soul for the others to leave. Prepare yourself for the call. Let us accompany you to dinner. The prentice is ours." Mrs. Warren clutched Lila protectively. "Take me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No," Emma cried, grabbing her arm. "You can't." But Mrs. Warren was already stepping forward, her face calm despite the terror in her eyes. "Take me, but leave my daughter. Leave all of them." The entity laughed, a sound that made the air itself shudder. "Very well," it said. Mrs. Warren turned to Emma and Lila, her voice soft. "Go," she said. "Take care of her." Before they could protest, the shadow consumed her. She didn't scream, didn't struggle. She simply disappeared, leaving only silence behind. When Emma and Lila returned to the house, the air felt heavy with grief. Lila clutched the broken crucifix Father Gabriel had left behind, her tiny hands trembling. "Is it over?" she whispered. Emma didn't answer. She glanced toward the attic, where Bella had been stored before all this began. The door was ajar, and the faint sound of laughter drifted down the stairs. "No," Emma said, her voice hollow. "It's never over. The next morning, the Warrens' house stood eerily quiet. Emma packed her belongings and moved away without a word to anyone. The house remained vacant, the shadows within, waiting patiently for their next victim. And in the attic, Bella sat on a dusty shelf, her single painted eye watching and waiting.